I was just talking for like, hey guys, I was just talking for like 2, 3 minutes, and I just realized I didn't even fucking click the record button, so I have to start again. But yeah, today we're gonna be talking about Israel, man. Like Israel, the Zionists. I shouldn't be making like faces and stuff like that and joking around a little bit because the situation is quite serious, man. I look at those pictures and those images of the Palestinians like just getting burned and bombed and raped and looted. Like it just kind of makes you flinch a little bit looking at that stuff, man. It's a bit unnerving, man. Like they're just killing everyone there, no mercy, nothing. Like just kill everybody. Yeah, I never really thought about that in war. Is there really rules to a war? Do rules exist in war? I mean, I've heard of the Geneva Convention, which means you cannot kill enemy prisoners, right? Like you cannot use them as labor, work slaves. You cannot certain things you cannot do, But do the Israelis follow any of that shit? No, they don't. They're bombing hospitals. They're bombing schools. They're bombing rail yards. They're bombing everything. No distinction between civilians and military. Just wholesale destruction of Gaza. That's what they've been doing since 1940, 46, 45. Yeah, I've just been kind of looking at that conflict a little bit more closely the past few days, and it just kind of fills me with such, it does kind of make you angry a little bit, rage. But then it's like you go back to what can you actually do about it? The Zionists are just so pathetic, in my opinion. Like Netanyahu and his defense minister Gantz, like they're some serious war criminals, man. Like some serious war criminals. The amount of people they've killed is just like holy shit. And then whenever you mention this, they always say, "What about October 7th?" And then if you criticize the Israelis, you're called an anti-Semite. It just doesn't. I just don't really understand how you can be without criticism, right? Like you're this holier than thou. Like you cannot be criticized. Why? Let's try to dissect this a little bit. Why are the Europeans so vocal about their support for Israel and the Americans? The Americans are even more vocal than the Europeans, but is it because of their guilt of the Holocaust and the partitions of Poland? Well, Poland and the Jews have a similar history. There are pogroms happening all over the place. But a pogrom, compared to the Holocaust, throwing people in ovens, and a pogrom is like when you get chased out of your land and stuff like that. People get killed, but it's not the same as industrial wholesale mass murder. It's like a slaughterhouse, essentially. That's what they were doing to the Jews in 1945 and 1944 and 1943. But because of that, the Palestinians, like you basically gave the Israelis a state at the expense of the Palestinians. And nobody really thought about that. I mean, they did, they just didn't give a fuck, right? Because it was the British mandate that created Israel and stuff like that. And the French also helped, the Americans also helped. And then they transferred their guilt to us, the Muslims, after the Holocaust. They feel bad because of what they did in the Holocaust. So that kind of gives Israel carte blanche to do whatever they want. I consider Israel a terrorist state. I mean, I'm nobody, right? I'm just a civilian. I'm just a guy making YouTube videos. But I do think they're terrorists. I think so. I think they're terrorists because the indiscriminate bombing, the facts on the ground, the journalists not being allowed into certain places, the kidnapping of Palestinian children, going to prison without charge, without trials. So, it's kind of hard to criticize Hamas kidnapping Israeli citizens when the Israelis are doing the same and they're doing it on a much larger scale. The abduction of Gilad Shimon, the Jewish soldier, the Israeli Zionist soldier, that were captured by the Hamas and they were sent to Gaza. It was there for a couple years. Why did they do that? They did that because they wanted to release Palestinian prisoners. Like, the Israelis are not just going to release people without you having some kind of leverage. They they don't even give them a trial. They don't even give them a charge, and they just throw them in prison, and that's it. Like, how does that? Like, I just can't understand how people would be okay with that. Perhaps some of them are guilty of something. Perhaps some of them may be so-called. I don't want to call them terrorists, man. I don't want to call them because even if they were doing things that would be considered as acts of terror by the West and by most people, the thing is, they're doing those acts as an act of resistance. They're trying to get the occupier off their land. They're trying to make noise so that people care about their situation, because think about it. Consider yourself as a Palestinian. You don't have an air force. You have no air force. Um, you don't have sovereignty. The Israelis can just come over anytime they like and attack you. Bombings, airstrikes. You have no food because the Israelis have blockaded your ports. Like, I mean, I understand that they're always going to go back to the October 7th attack, just like the Americans will go back to Pearl Harbor. But there's an important distinction to be made between both of those kind of fight wars, so-called wars. I don't really consider the Palestine-Israel war a war. I consider it a genocide of Palestinians. But comparisons: the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor because they were having an oil embargo by the United States, because the United States wasn't happy with how Japan was in China and they were taking over China and expanding their war force, stuff like this, right? The Palestinians attacked because they wanted to release their own prisoners as a prisoner exchange. They wanted to get the occupier out of their lands. They wanted to perhaps even get revenge for all the people that died by the Zionists. So, yeah, man, that's just like my little thoughts on the matter. Like, I mean, growing up, I used to see, I remember looking at the airstrikes on Gaza in 2014. Back then, I was like 16 years old, but I never really thought about it like that. I would look at the bombings and destruction, and I would just see it, and it wouldn't really affect me or move me because I don't know, the media was kind of portraying it as Israel was the victim. Israel is not the aggressor. Israel's the one being attacked. Israel's the one fighting for survival. But they're a much more powerful force than Hamas because Gaza is basically encircled. Like, from the sea, they're blockaded on every side. Apparently, there's some weapons coming through in the tunnels from Rafah, from Egypt. Apparently, the Egyptians are arming them through the tunnels towards Rafah, but yeah, that's probably the case. But the Americans are arming the Israelis, the Zionists. So yeah, man, I just don't. I don't know, man. Like, the British are to blame for this, and the Americans, and the French, and the Europeans. If you look at the root cause of it, but that no longer matters. Israel exists as a state. Do I think they have a right to exist as a state? Do I think that Israel should exist as a state? Do I think that they deserve to exist as a state? That's all questions people are probably thinking, right? Do I think they deserve to exist as a state? Deserve. I don't think deserve has anything to do with it. They won that territory by right of conquest, right? Just like every other civilization. So I guess by that metric, they do deserve to be there. But there should be some kind of agreement on the Palestinian West Bank. They shouldn't be encroaching on that territory. They shouldn't be creating more settlers. They shouldn't be expanding. Everything they're doing is against international law. They don't care. They don't give a fuck. They're just killing people indiscriminately. October 7th was just a reaction. That's all it was. It was just a reaction to the unjustified killings of the Palestinians and the wholesale murder and slaughter of the Palestinians. That was the reason for the October 7th attack. It was a resist. It was an act of resistance to try to get their hostages back from Israel. They're literally slaving away in a cell. The Israelis said no, they're not giving them any human rights, no trial, no nothing. What do you do? What do you do in that situation? How do you get your people back? What can you do? How can you get those Palestinians back to Gaza? How? How? They will not. They will not negotiate with you for the terror. I almost said terrorists. They're not terrorists, but they won't negotiate for them. They won't release them in good faith. Of course, they won't. What do you do then? Like, how do you, what other means exists for the Palestinians to get their people back? They haven't even given them a trial, so you don't know what they've done. Essentially, they're innocent and they're in jail. But obviously, the Israelis are going to say they're terrorists and blah blah blah. But I'm done with this topic. It just makes me pissed off. Is what it is.